Every new year, our next speaker designs and shares a toolkit that makes the occasion nourishing, fulfilling, and truly happy. Please welcome Chief Design Officer at Fractal Analytics, Param Venkataraman.
I'm going to talk to you about being a design leader. But before that, I'm going to share a quick personal story. This is me in 2008. Some of you have an idea of where this is going. This is me in 2014. I took the full plunge. And, I think, as you can see now, the transformation is still on. I've decided to focus more on the beard now that I have much of a choice. So the point is, that's why the actual title of my of my presentation is Being a Design Leader and How Not to Lose Your Hair in the Process. Those of you still have it, hold on to it. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the journey of being a design leader looks like and what might be some practices, principles, and methods that you can sort of inculcate or try, and some things that I've tried and worked. I'm going to share some of that. So what are the typical stages that a designer may go through? Let's look at some typical stages. This is not supposed to be perfect, but just to give you a sense of what might be these stages. So there's this whole stage of starting with design craft, right? You start with design craft, go deep into what you're trying to do in your discipline, in your area of expertise. Then you look at leading projects, leading people, leading designers. Then you lead a design department or a design team, and then you lead design for an organization, right? So this is, one of the possible journeys that a design leader might go through. Now let's look at challenges that we all face in this journey, right? Again, not an exhaustive set, but just to give you a sense of what are some of these challenges. So I'll read out a few of these. I want to switch to design strategy, but there aren't enough opportunities. That's one, for example. Going deep in my craft versus leading projects and people, which path should I take? You hear this question a lot. How do we deliver great work in compressed time frames? How do I balance supporting the team and getting the work done? Leading projects and people feels like a lot of managerial work, doesn't feel like design work, right? How many of you feel this? I'm sure a lot of hands will go up, right? And as you go more to the right, showing business impact of design outcomes. How do I do that, right? Convincing business leaders that there is value for strategic design. And understanding business and numbers is so hard and frankly feels boring, right? How many of us feel like that, right? So these are all the challenges that, just to give you an example of some of the challenges. I believe that it's important to reflect and dig deeper into some of this, to look at underlying what's going on. It's not enough to just look at these questions, and I can't prescriptively give you answers for any of these because the contexts are so different. So I have learned some practices and principles and made a lot of mistakes, so I'm going to share some of that. Because I believe reflection is the nursery of intentionality. I love this line. It's a quote by Ryder Carroll, who's come up with this brilliant thing called the bullet journal. And so it's there in this book, Reflection is a Nursery of Intentionality. I love this line. I feel like leaving it here for a few seconds for you to literally read it and get the gravity of it. So I'm going to share these principles and practices for reflection and being a design leader. This is the framework that I'm going to be using. There's 3 slabs to it, and we're going to unpack each of these slabs one by one. The first one is about how we work with business, right? And there are 3 principles that I'm going to share in that. The first one is design must have a reason for existence. And as designers, we tend to believe that design can be applied to anything and everything. We believe that any problem can be solved using design. But what we don't realize and what we don't think about is that how does that occur to non-designers, right? And what is the way in which that can be relevant for non-designers, and especially people in the business. So I'm going to share with you a journey that we went through, that I went through in my past role at my previous job, and how we looked at applying the relevance of design in that context, and why that's important to unpack that. So I was working at IDEO a few years back, and one of the projects that we worked on was with Dr. Reddy's, a pharmaceutical company. And so they came to IDEO with this question about how do we build a more patient-centric culture in the company? How do we build a more innovation-centric company? How do we build a more empathy-focused, empathy-centric culture? And so that journey began with IDEO helping Dr. Reddy's rethink its purpose, redefine what its reason for existence is. And this was a long journey, and it was not just about coming up with a cool tagline or a cool statement. That's not the point of a purpose statement. The point was from that purpose statement to go from translating that into reality, and we did that through a series of projects and through a series of interventions to look at how do you translate that purpose into reality. So this is from the IDEO website, and this has become a case study on their website, and you can read more about it. So this was the defining sort of statement that we came up with, which this is where it all began. Good health can't wait. It looks like a very simple, kind of four words, right? But if you unpack it, good health talks about the idea of patient centricity, but doesn't stop there. It's about looking at people's health even beyond patients, right? It's about understanding really that's the primary focus that we should have in healthcare. The second part of it talks about can't wait. The reason we chose can't wait is about two things. One, it brings in a sense of urgency. It brings in a sense of, how do we solve healthcare problems in a way that have not been solved before? And therefore, it's saying innovation without using the word innovation, right? So that's the whole sort of way in which we conceptualized it, good health can't wait. And this actually began a whole journey. And when we introduced this to the management, and then we talked about how do you translate this into projects and sort of real life outcomes, the management started seeing the value of it and started realizing that if you have to really live good health can't wait, then you need two things. One, you need empathy, and two, you need innovation. And that is where obviously design plays a role. So the point is, how is design as an organization in your, as a capability in your organization, connecting it, how is it connected to the organization purpose, and how is it connecting to the organization needs? And that's really the connection that you have to make. And it's not explicit. If you don't explicitly call that out, people don't understand it. And so how we translated that is we started, and it went all the way into starting up a design thinking innovation lab, which I moved from IDEO to Dr. Reddy's and started this up. It was called Studio 5B. And we started this in 2014, and it was a journey where we began by looking at all the different touch points across the company and translating good health can't wait into different touch points, both inside the company as well as outside. And so to give you an example, this is one of the ideas that we developed from scratch, where we looked at how do we help smokers quit smoking or get in control of their habit. And so, again, a long story short, we launched a digital service, and this is in the US. It's live on the App Store in the US, not in India. It's called Amy. It's a digital service to help smokers control their habit. And so the whole intent was to go beyond the traditional concepts of pharma and healthcare. And so this app service helps you sort of control and understand what are you smoking, when are you smoking, what are the habits that you've developed over time, and how do you sort of keep control of that, and what is the personalized way in which you can actually manage your habit, because every smoker smokes differently. Eventually, this went on to become a case study in one of IDEO used courses on designing for change, and so you can read a lot more about it when you sign up for this course. So the idea that how do you look at the organization purpose and strategy, and what is the role for design there is, again, something that I'm trying to unpack now with a second example. The company where I now work at, Fractal, is an AI consulting company, and our mission is to power every human decision in the enterprise. Now, if you look at the statement, I mean, it's not talking about AI. It's not talking about technology. It's talking about the human dimension, right? And that's the fundamental nature of, that's the role where that's a place where design can play a strong role in actually bringing that human dimension alive. And at Fractal, what we're talking about is powering every human decision by looking at the intersection of AI, engineering, and design. So design sits at the core of the organization. It's not something that people, it's not something that you have to sort of explicitly call out more than this. And to give you an example of how this is translating into reality, you have to put your money where your mouth is. And about a year and a half, 2 years back, Fractal acquired a company called Final Mile, which is a behavior sciences, sort of very deep expertise in behavior science. They've developed something called behavior architecture. And it brings together cognitive neuroscience, behavioral economics, and design. And they've developed a fantastic approach to understanding what causes behavior change and what can actually influence behavior change. And this is one of their flagship projects that they did many years back, where they looked at how do you understand human behavior to influence the way people are crossing the road, the railway tracks, and trying to reduce the number of deaths that happen on these railway tracks. And so it's a fascinating sort of example of how you can bring in some of this. And as you can see, the point is you can't power every human decision in the enterprise if you don't understand the human behavior and if you don't bring that dimension to it. So that is the first question that I would like you to reflect on, which is what is the role for design in fulfilling your organization purpose and strategy? Are you clear about it? And are you articulating it enough to your stakeholders in being able to understand the connections between the two? The second principle under the first slab of the pyramid, go where the suction is. So I had the good fortune of working with Claudia Kochka. She was a very seasoned P&G veteran, and she used to be working with A.G. Lafley, the CEO of P&G, in transforming P&G as a consumer-centric, design-led organization many years back. And this was something that they partnered with IDEO again on. And so Claudia told me this, which is go where the suction is. Now, many of us feel that in organizations that we're working in, it's hard to get buy-in from stakeholders and business stakeholders on design and the value of design, right? We often feel that we're dealing with this big mountain of skeptics, right? How many of us feel like that? Raise your hand. Yep, lots of hands going up. And so the thing is, what we don't realize is this is one part of the organization, not the whole. There are these people who are outside of that circle, which is what I'm calling neutrals, right? And there is the circle outside of that, which is what I'm calling enthusiasts. These are people who are extremely open, who are extremely hungry, extremely aware of design, about innovation, and are looking for change, who are looking to do something different. And these are the people that you should be starting with. If you try and start trying to convince and spend all your money and energy on the ones inside the deepmost circle, in the innermost circle, then it's an exhausting process. And if you start with that, you're not going to get too far, right? So go where the suction is. Don't try to boil the ocean. Start with the enthusiasts. Start working with them. The neutrals will start seeing some of the changes that are happening, and they'll see some of the early success that the enthusiasts are having, and then they will start moving. And then eventually you'll get to the skeptics. And by the way, not all skeptics are going to change, and that's okay too, right? Trust me, even if you get a part or a fraction of the skeptics to convert, that's more than enough in most organizations. So the question to ask yourself in this, the question to reflect is who are the enthusiasts, neutrals, and skeptics in your organization? And how can you engage more deeply in a very specific way with the enthusiasts? You'll probably realize that you're actually spending a lot of your time and energy on the others and not enough time on the enthusiasts. The third principle that I'm going to share in business is alignment, alignment, alignment. As designers, all of us love this idea of alignment, right? We are obsessed with making sure that things are aligned in visual artifacts that we're creating, any design artifacts that we're creating. So let's bring that same principle into organizational design, right? So the question that we often ask ourselves is, when we're driving change through design in organizations is, should we go top down or should we go bottom up, right? That's one question. And we think about, let's get the CEO on board, and if we get the CEO on board, everything is going to be much better. I wish I had the CEO on board. But guess what? In my experience, it's not sufficient. It's an important starting point to have the CEO on board, but it's not sufficient. There's a lot more that goes on beyond that. In my experience, I've seen that there are 4 layers that you need to engage with. There's the top management, there's the senior management, there's the middle management, and there's the individual contributors. More often than not, we are focusing on the top, and that's where or sometimes we look at the bottom, but what we don't realize is there are these 4 pieces in that slice. So my recommendation is, rather than top or down, top down or bottom up, look at it from a perspective of a slice. You need to work with one entire slice of the organization. And I've drawn disproportionate focus to the senior management, because guess what? You might have your CEO on your side, but that's not enough. This layer is even more important than the CEO. This layer is where you will actually get stuff done, whether you have or whether you don't have your CEO support. And this is the layer that I've made the mistake in my past of not focusing enough on and learned it the hard way. So my recommendation is go this way, go left to right in the organization, go slice by slice rather than top down or bottom up. So the question that I will ask you to reflect on is, which vertical slice of our organization should we focus on, and how might we deeply engage and align our senior management? What are you doing right now, and how can that aspect improve? All right, so I covered the business slab of the pyramid. Now I'm going to talk about the craft. The craft is something that we all deeply care about. This is the meat of our work. This is where we all sort of started our careers. This is what we really care about and we are passionate about, right? So here I'm going to introduce 2 principles. One is, what is your T, right? Now, many of you have heard about this concept of a T-shaped person, right? How many of you heard about this concept of a T-shaped person? A lot of you have, yes. IDEO has spoken a lot about this concept of being a T-shaped person. So the original idea of the idea of a T in the way IDEO described it was that the vertical in your T is really your core area of expertise. Excuse me. Your core area of expertise, and that's really what you develop depth in over time. The horizontal, the way they defined it was that it's about empathy, and it's about having the openness and the willingness to collaborate with people from other disciplines. So the idea is that if you have both of these on the horizontal and the vertical, you would be very good in working in innovation and cross-functional, cross-disciplinary collaboration. And I think that makes sense, and no sort of critique to that. What I've done is sort of made a small modification to that and seen that work better in my experience, which is, the question, and so if the way I look at the horizontal is that it's not just about the empathy and openness to collaboration, but it's about what are the other skills that you have that are actually in your horizontal. So for example, I started my career as an interaction designer, and that was the vertical in my T. The horizontal was street photography. I loved photography, and I practiced that from the time I was in college. And so the horizontal in my case was street photography, and the vertical in my case when I started was interaction design. So the question that I'd like you to think about is what's the vertical in your T right now, right? And this might seem like a very simple question. It's actually very hard to do, and the older you get, it actually gets harder to answer that question. And I'll show you, and also the question is, what should or what could be the vertical in my T? What do you want it to be a few years from now, right? Are you okay with the way it is right now? So these are very simple but very, very powerful questions to inquire and think about your craft. What do you really want to go deep into? So for example, the way my career has evolved over time, not that this is the right way or whatever, just to give you an example of how this works. As I said, I started with interaction design as a vertical in my T, and street photography was my horizontal. As I sort of, worked further in that, the interaction design depth continued, and I grew deeper in that. With time, I started leading design projects, and that started adding a kind of a horizontal slab on the T. And then, And then I was fascinated with design ethnography, and I got really hooked onto that in the early 2000s and mid 2000s. And I said, this is really why I wanted to get into the design profession. This is where I connect with understanding how problems are and how do people behave and how do you translate that into solutions. And so I started gravitating towards that, and over time, design ethnography became my vertical and interaction design moved to the horizontal, right? And now it's been so many years that I've not practiced as an interaction designer. I mean, I'm practically, and things have changed so much that I can't claim to be an interaction designer anymore. So, and then over time, now, of course, in the last several years, I believe the vertical in my T is more about design-led transformation. And I'm not a master at it yet, but I'm working on it and learning and figuring it out. And on the horizontal, I've got design ethnography, I've got street photography, I've got mindfulness, and I've got interaction design. So the question is, given where you are right now, what's the vertical in your T, what's the horizontal? Try and spend some time thinking about that and putting that down. And the question is, what do I want the vertical to be, vertical in my T to be in a few years from now? The second part of this aspect of craft, the second principle is about going deep while learning fluency and mastery. So in the T, one of the things is that if you're not deep enough in the core vertical strength that you have, it's not good enough. Because then the T literally has nothing to stand on, right? Literally. So it's very important to go deep in that and to not sort of skim the surface there. So how do you know if you're going deep enough? What's the way to know whether you're actually developing master expertise there? So one of the frameworks that IDEO talks about is the idea of learning, fluency, and mastery. And I thought this is a very simple and a very powerful framework for thinking about where are you in your career right now, what skills are you developing, and in those skills do you have learning, fluency, and mastery? So for example, so just to unpack this a bit, right? So learning is all about the aspect of doing something new for the first time, or you're still learning. At this stage, you're taking a lot of help from people, you're figuring it out, you're making a lot of mistakes, you take a lot of time, it takes effort. It's that typical sort of process. In fluency, you're starting to get to that point where you're actually independent. You've figured it out, you've started getting a hang of things, you don't need that much mentoring except for sort of very specialized things, and you're starting to do everything on your own. At mastery, you're at that next level where you actually start defining new standards, where you start thinking about completely new ways of doing that thing, and you start teaching others and guiding others and coming up with new sort of practices, right? So let's put this in context to a specific skill, like let's say design research and strategy, right? So any of you interested in design research or practicing design researchers, here's an example for you. So these are the core skills required for a design researcher and strategist. Framing the problem and research objectives, designing the research, the methods and the tools, preparing for the research, conducting the actual research, the actual interview. Most people think that design research is about going and interviewing people. It's not just that. If you see, there's a lot that happens before and after that. Synthesizing the inputs. Well, how do you sort of take all that data that you gathered from the field and you came back? How do you sort of synthesize and make sense out of it? What are the insights and unmet needs from that? How do you identify the right opportunities? How do you validate that? So I can go on, but you get the drift, right? So there's a whole lot of skills that are involved in being a design researcher. Now, let me take one of these bullet points, and I'll blow that up, and I'll show you what does that look like in learning, fluency, and mastery. So I'm just taking preparing for research as an example. Now let's look at learning, conceptualizing and developing a discussion guide and tools for primary research with inputs and help from others, and the final version would probably develop after several iterations, right? The stuff in bold is really what distinguishes one from the other. In fluency, I will conceptualize and do this on my own. I'm independent. And I may or may not take inputs from others, and the iterations would be minimal and optional. When it comes to mastery, I'm actually developing new methods and tools, and I'm pushing the envelope there, and I'm coming up with completely new ways of imagining what I'm doing, right? And I'm setting new standards. So the question to ask yourself is, where on learning, fluency, and mastery are you at in your core skill that you identified in the vertical in your T, right? Are you keeping a sharp sort of focus on that, and are you looking at it from the perspective of each of these core skills that you're developing, and are you thinking about learning, fluency, and mastery in that? So that was the second slab in the pyramid, which is craft, right? Which is what is your T, and how do you look at learning, fluency, and mastery as a way to get depth? The third slab in the pyramid is the idea of self, and this is the most important one, right? So what I've seen from my own experience and what I've seen from mentors that have taught me is the higher you go, the deeper you need to look inside, right? And what do I mean by that? This looks a little bit like me without the beard and the mustache, right? So not intentional. So I'm going to ask you some very fundamental questions that might seem weird. Some of you may have thought about it, some of you have not thought about it, but you'll be surprised what the connections are between this way of inquiry and thinking about this at your self level and how that impacts your work. For example, what's your relationship with money? I'm going to leave that there for a few seconds for you to get it. How many of us love money? How many of us have a great relationship with money? Really? Okay. As designers, most of us suck at money, right? How many of us want to acknowledge that, right? How many of us hate having conversations with people about money, including your own salary, right? Proudly raise your hands, right? That's the extent to which our relationship with money is so not, appropriate. And you'll see there are many other people in this world whose relationship with money is so different, right? And when we say we are bringing design into a business, what are we actually talking about? It's about relating with business. And in our popular culture, the concept of business and money are inseparable, right? I mean, I don't believe that businesses exist only for the purpose of money. That's definitely one of the intentions. But in our mind, that those two things are completely equated. So when we think about a flawed relationship with money, that's essentially mirroring our flawed relationship with business. So it's important to embrace that if you have to really go hand in glove with people in the business and really be able to work with them and bring design to business and bring business to design. That's question number one. You thought this is tough, now it's getting tougher. The second one, what's your relationship with authority, right? So most of us who've gotten into the design profession have had to, go away from the mainstream. We've taken the offbeat path. We've sort of done things which are very different, right? We've not gone the traditional route in India, especially, right? Traditionally in India, you do engineering, medicine, or you study something CA or whatever, right? So here, you've taken completely different path. Now it's a lot more accepted, but 10, 15, 20 years back it wasn't. And so by nature, all of us are rebels at some level, right? And that rebellion is so hardwired in our system that we don't even realize, even now, many years later, we are in subtle ways rebelling again and again at some different points of time or the other. So that's the question, which is that if you are going to work in a large organization or even in a reasonable sized organization and you're looking at the institution, which is which is basically a placeholder for authority, what is your relationship with authority, which therefore mirrors your relationship with that corporate institution? And unless you alter that, you're not going to be comfortable working with that big institution. The third one, why do certain kind of people or situations keep recurring in our life? How many of you have noticed that? And the more we resist it, the more it persists. So that's again something that we need to figure out and really reflect on and think about, why is that happening, and how can I become, get to at a level of peace or a level of clarity that I can be with those people or in those situations without getting disturbed, without getting all my hot buttons triggered. The second last one, actually. What do I need to let go before starting something new? And this is important because we're all creators, right? And we love getting to new ideas, new projects, new job opportunities, new everything. But before we go into the new, are we thinking and reflecting enough about what do we need to let go? What are we still carrying on? What are we still holding on to? And the last one, do I vision my future? And now, a lot of people we spend an enormous amount of time planning a lot of things for the future. But I don't mean planning, I mean visioning. Visioning is not really about saying that this is step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I will do this. It's more about what vision do you see for yourself in the future. And it's a bit like, that's the whole point of design, which is about imagining the future, right? And how do you apply that to your own life? I don't know how much of us are we doing that. So this is a book, for example, that talks about design the life you love, and it actually uses design thinking principles to apply to your life. So you can actually do a lot of activities in this and start thinking about what actually matters to you, what do you actually want to be spending time on, and how do you want to design your life. This is one example. There are a few other books out there like that. At the end of each year for the last 4 years, I've been publishing a toolkit that I put up on LinkedIn. It's called Looking Forward. And what I do in this is, at the end of each year, on the last day of the year, most people go and get drunk that night. I do that also sometimes, but before that, in the earlier part of the day, I spend time on reflecting on the year. How did the year go by? What is it that I need to think about that worked well, what didn't? What is it that I need to let go of? What am I still holding on to? What are the things that I should be really reflecting on, are repeating patterns? Whatever, right? So there's a bunch of questions that I put down on my toolkit, and I've shared that with a lot of people online. And the second question, the second part of that, I do that on the first day of the next year, which is, trying to vision what should my next year be like. And this is not about coming up with resolutions. It's not about making a plan, saying I will do this, I will do that. It's really about getting clear about what is it that you want, what is it that truly matters to you, and how do you vision that. So to give you an example, in the year 2011 or 2012, I was working with an exec coach for a few months, and one of the questions he asked me was something similar, which is, how do I see the vision for my future? And the answer that came to me at that time, and I'm not kidding you, this is exactly what I told him at that time. I said, I would love to be part of a large organization, a multi-billion-dollar company, working with the CEO of the company directly and transforming and using design to transform the company. I literally said these words, I'm not kidding you, right? 3 years later, I was exactly doing this when I started working at Dr. Reddy's, and that's exactly what I'm doing now when I'm at Fractal. So, I'm not kidding you. I'm not making this stuff up. This is real, and if it can happen for me, I don't see why it may not happen for someone else. So in summary, I think this is the sort of the overall framework, principles and practices for reflection at business, at the level of craft, and at the level of self. Again, I want to bring this back. I think this is fundamentally the underlying principle, which is reflection. And I think fundamentally, this is really about being a design leader is no longer just about, it doesn't mean being that design leader, but it's also being a mindful design leader. Thank you very much.